Welcome to our Covenant Sunday for September. In the series that we've been doing this year on persons that we may see as letters of recommendation from God for us, we're going to look this month at Father John Evans, who is the first and until now the only Australian-born Schoenstatt Father. We want to reflect on parts of his life in relation to the shrine in Kew in Melbourne, the first Schoenstatt shrine in Australia. As you'll be aware, the property on which the shrine stood had to be sold at the beginning of this year, and unfortunately the shrine no longer exists. It was demolished. So we're trusting that our Mother Thrice Admirable will show us the way into the future so that we can preserve this heritage. Some of you may not be aware that our founder actually wrote a letter for the blessing of that shrine on the 11th of May 1952, and also that 3 people offered their lives for the fruitfulness of the shrine. So we believe Our Lady is loyal and she will show the way forward. But now let's go to Father John Evans. Back in 1991, at the National Conference, Father Evans shared with us some of the history of Schoenstatt in Australia, and I will be quoting largely from this talk that he gave. It will give us a picture of the loyalty that he had for Schoenstatt, for our MTA, for our father and founder, and for the shrine. He paid a high price for this loyalty, but he was convinced that God had called him to Schoenstatt, and he remained steadfast. The aspect of Father Evans' loyalty is surely a letter of recommendation from God to us to emulate. The history now begins, and I quote, "The Palatines came to Australia in 1901, actually before Schoenstatt was founded. However, the Palatines who came to Australia in the 1920s and 1930s had grown up with Schoenstatt. And this will explain why it's possible for Father Evans to share the following, and I quote, "In 1934, we have recorded the first official birth of Schoenstatt in Australia. On the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1934, the Palatines in Beagle Bay, it's Western Australia, consecrated themselves and their work to our Mother Thrice Admirable of Schoenstatt. As the chronist reported of the ceremony, quote, they had placed a picture of our Mother Thrice Admirable over the high altar in order to make the church as similar as and as beautiful as possible to the Mother Shrine in Schoenstatt. This entering into the covenant of love was a genuine involvement in original Schoenstatt." Father Evans continues, "On the 8th of September 1935, we find the chronist with a similar report. On the occasion of the first Holy Communion in Beagle Bay, after the children had placed their candles and flowers around the MTA picture above the main altar, the climax of the celebration came when, during benediction, the monstrance was placed in the circle of the MTA picture and the candles. Here the chronist reports, the scene brought back memories and love of our Mother Shrine in Schoenstatt." Father Evans continued that this Schoenstatt covenant of love entered into by these young Palatine fathers and brothers in Beagle Bay, a covenant which was lived in the most trying conditions and isolation and tested by being rejected, particularly and especially during World War II, by the land of their adoption, whilst maintaining a service of selfless love, is the basic spiritual foundation on which our Schoenstatt family in Australia builds." End of quote. Father Evans goes on to mention in his account some of the essential elements of our Schoenstatt life which come to play in our Australian history are the attachment to the shrine, to our Mother Thrice Admirable of Schoenstatt, and to our Father and Founder. Likewise, nothing without you, nothing without us. And not least, our Mother's readiness to allow the pilgrim graces of transformation of a home and of fruitfulness to flow. End of quote. It is certainly a challenge when we hear a small example from Father Evans about the sacrifices the first fathers and brothers made in those early years. He shared a small example of the dedication and courage of the first Palatine fathers and brothers. In the early days in Tarden, it's Western Australia, the monastery was a corrugated iron building with internal dividing walls of hessian between chapel, kitchen, dining room and private rooms. Every day, Father Albert knelt for an hour of adoration at the hottest part of the day. They were so poor that Father Albert gave each brother one orange as a Christmas present, and each was thrilled to get it. The end of this example. At the end of 1935, 3 Palatine students arrived in Australia to complete their studies for the priesthood. One of these students was George Ville, a late vocation who believed with all his heart in the mission of Schoenstatt. At the beginning of 1950, Father Ville was appointed novice master in Kew, and Father Evans became a novice under his care. Father Evans continues now, and I quote him, "Under the inspiration of Father Ville, Father John Hennessy, the first Australian Palatine father, began the first boys and girls groups for our Schoenstatt family. Again, under the inspiration of Father Ville, the novices, students, brothers and the groups made the request for the erection in the grounds of Kew, a shrine to our Mother Thrice Admirable and Queen of Schoenstatt. The Regional Council of the Palatines gave the permission in principle, but the building program had to wait. Under the leadership of Father Ville, the novices, students and brothers framed a large MTA picture with a homemade 8-corner frame and, on Our Lady's birthday, solemnly erected it in the house chapel on a provisory side altar until a shrine could be built. The young community then set to and began to convert an old bush house in the garden into a shrine and present it to our MTA as her home and throne. When the rector, Father Gierke, saw these active preparations, he decided it was time to erect a proper shrine. For this purpose, Father Gierke employed a German architect, Mr. Baum. After seeing photos of the Mother Shrine in Schoenstatt, he drew up plans for a similar structure to be built out of timber and so fit into the Australian setting. The local council had objections to the erection of a chapel there, and so more offerings were needed. Father Evans stressed that, quote, "At this point, 2 important points need to be remembered. Firstly, the caring Palatine fathers were very conscious of the anti-German sentiment in Australia at that time and did not want the shrine to express something German, but to be a place of grace where Australians would find a home. Secondly, within our Schoenstatt family at that time, there was still no universal agreement on erecting shrines as exact replicas of the original." End of quote. Because of the objections of the local council to the building of this shrine, I quote Father Evans, "The students and novice," which was himself, "intensified striving during 1951 with the aim to make contributions to the capital of grace so that the council would give permission for the erection of the shrine. An external expression of this was the handmade Servus Maria Nunquam Peribit light frame around the MTA picture. This was all made by the students and novice in our own time, and often at night out of materials which were second-hand." Father Evans's mother was a very active member of an auxiliary which had been set up to help support the Palatines in their mission. In this way, Father Evans was introduced to the Palatines as he was growing up. So we hear now Father Evans continue, quote, "In conjunction with the making of the light frame for the MTA picture, there was an intense preparation of our consecration. During the night before Our Lady's birthday, the consecration prayer was signed by 5 students and myself, and sealed in the back of the picture. It is still there today. And on the morning of the 8th of September, we made our consecration together as we reinstalled the MTA picture in the house chapel with the light frame. Later that afternoon, 3 of the students had to leave for Rome to continue their studies. The consecration prayer reads, I quote, "We humbly consecrate to Thee our entire body and soul, with all the graces which God in His infinite mercy bestows on us, and those which we merit on our own behalf, so that pouring them into the fund of grace, you may distribute them with a mother's love from our chapel, as you did so from Schoenstatt. By this offering, we beg Thee to perfect God's plan for us, to strengthen the bonds of communal love amongst us, and to establish the kingdom of Christ in our country." Shortly after this consecration, the local council lifted their objections to the erection of the shrine, and on the 27th of October 1951, the foundations were laid. The following quote is important in understanding Father Evan's loyalty to Schoenstatt in the time of crisis between Schoenstatt and the Palatines. He shared, quote, "During the time of the building of the shrine in Kew, in a discussion with my novice master, Father Ville, I stated to him that Palotti was a saint with a dream, but a dream that was never realized and could not be realized. However, I believed that in Schoenstatt something new was there which made the dream of Palotti real and attainable, and so long as I could be guaranteed that Palotti and Schoenstatt belonged together, then I could see sense in making my profession in the Palatines. But without Schoenstatt, then the Palatines had nothing, and I would not remain. Father Ville assured me that I could make my profession on that unity of Palotti and Schoenstatt in the plan of God." The end of quote. Then came the 11th of May 1952, the blessing of the shrine in Kew, and Father Evans relates, "One of the greatest joys of all on the eve and of the opening of the shrine was to receive a letter from Father Kentenich. This was recognised as the founding document for Schoenstatt in Australia and acknowledged and an acknowledgement of the genuineness of the shrine as the home and powerhouse of our Mother Thrice Admirable and Queen of Schoenstatt. The founding document of our Father and Founder needs to be read in conjunction with the sermon at the opening and blessing by the charismatic church leader Archbishop Mannix. In many ways, this throws light on the providential mission and vision of our Schoenstatt family in Australia. Among other things, Archbishop Mannix said, quote, "Small things can be very beautiful, little things can be very powerful, but from this little chapel I am hopeful and confident that great blessings will flow. And I hope and believe that having made this very beautiful gift to our Blessed Lady, from this chapel the lay apostolate will go forth and go from strength to strength. And when you and I have gathered to our fathers, people will be able to say, the Catholic apostolate came in time to Australia. They flourished and they aimed powerful in Australia. And that, so far as we can say, under God and the protection of our Blessed Lady, the Catholic apostolate served Australia, and, saving Australia, they saved perhaps the whole Pacific. I have no doubt at all that under the providence of God and with the help of the Blessed Mother, this shrine will be a storehouse of great power in Australia." End of quote. In 1954, Father Evans was sent to Schoenstatt in Germany to complete his studies. After 3 weeks in Rome, he arrived in Koblenz, and from the Palatine house in Ehrenbreitstein, he was driven to Schoenstatt. About his time in Schoenstatt, he shared, quote, "Even though my heart was filled with a great joy, it was also jolted with a great disappointment. I experienced in the Palatine seminary a lukewarmness and half-heartedness to Schoenstatt. The moment of ecstasy had become the moment of the greatest disappointment. Thanks be to God, our Mother and Queen stood by me, and I immediately resolved to find and gain as much as possible of the life, the vision, and the mission which she had given us in her shrine through our Father. It was a moment of undeserved grace." End of quote. Father Evans spent 3 years in Schoenstatt, and these years were years of tension and trial. The reason was because he remained loyal to our father, who was in exile, while the Palatines were steering another path, which did not include Father Kentenich. Some of his course brothers were expelled from the Palatines, but because Father Evans had already made his final profession, he could not be sent away. However, he was very soon sent back to Australia. The following is what Father Evans related about how he found the movement on his return. Quote, "During my 3 years in Schoenstatt, the movement was developing around the shrine in Kew, but it also experienced its difficulties. The visit of the General Superior of the Palatines, who was partly instrumental in the exile of our father, had brought a wavering in the hearts of many Palatines in regards to Schoenstatt. He had also used his skills in turning them against our father in exile. On my return, I found life around the shrine in Kew to have grown, but was more subdued than before, and I was left with the question whether it was a passing phase of growth or was it going the wrong way. I was astounded at the lack of information among my fellow students as to what had happened with our society and Schoenstatt. It was difficult to participate in community group work as my heart was elsewhere." The tension had its effect on, and Father Evans admitted, quote, "Physically I knew I was not well, but I would not go to a doctor until my ordination. When Father Bose, on his arrival from Germany, delivered my vestments and chalice with the words Victima Patris, victim of the Father, on them, there was hesitation by the Palatines as to whether I should be ordained. However, our MTA was faithful, and for my ordination to the priesthood on the 3rd of December 1958, I received in reply to my invitation a short letter from our Father. It is something which I have always treasured." End of quote. First half of 1959, Father Evans was not well and could not be sent to the missions in WA. And then in the mid-1959, he was stationed at Kew. He shared, "The years working from our mother's shrine in Kew were wonderful, but also hard. The workload often allowed for only 4 to 5 hours sleep a night for months at a time. Meals were irregular, but most difficult was the continuous mistrust and attacks by fellow Palatine fathers. Some went even so far as telling the girls in the groups that they should not trust nor listen to me, as I was under investigation by the Holy Office and could not be trusted. During the years in Kew, I kept myself informed of what was happening in Schoenstatt through the official letters which came from Rome and Germany." End of quote. One can perceive through these words how much Father Evans was convinced of Schoenstatt and its mission, and that he was prepared to sacrifice everything for this mission. Let us continue now the journey. Quote, "Toward the end of 1963, we were ordained to finish the celebration of Covenant Days on the 18th of each month and transfer them to the 22nd. These were to be called Pelotti celebrations. I refused to cancel the Covenant Days. But then I also knew that the time must be approaching for divine providence to clarify the situation. In January 1964, I was suddenly transferred to Tardan, Western Australia. For me, personally, the Palatines had broken the union of Pelotti and Schoenstatt, and I no longer felt obliged under obedience to maintain my exile. I had encouraged the groups around the shrine in Kew to keep up the Covenant Day celebrations, and we refused to hand over the names of the 300 possible candidates for new groups at the beginning of 1964. As I was often in Perth, I took the opportunity through our sisters to again come into contact with our course. What had happened to any of them in the intervening years was a mystery to me. Remember, some of them had been expelled from the seminary. The message came back that things were moving quickly and to wait a little longer. After receiving the news in 1964 that Rome had officially separated Schoenstatt from the Palatines, I informed the groups around Kew that they no longer had to heed anything the Palatines said about Schoenstatt. They were free. The Palatine Provincial immediately ordered me not to have any personal or pastoral connection with the people in the movement in Melbourne. As the Palatines prepared for the General Chapter in 1965, we were asked what we would do if the Palatines completely pulled out of Schoenstatt. My answer was clear. As soon as that would happen, my profession would no longer be valid, and I would leave. This did happen, and as soon as I received news of the erection of the Institute of the Schoenstatt Fathers in July 1965, I applied for permission to leave and seek a bishop for incardination. My mother responded to a Palatine who spoke to her about my leaving, quote, "You introduced John to Schoenstatt and guided him to it. Schoenstatt became the love of his life, and he has given to it all his love and life. He is remaining loyal to his love and conviction, and you are not. If this decision is wrong, then you will have to carry the responsibility before God as you led him in this way." It's the end of the quote of what his mother said. He continued, "At the end of 1965, I left Tarden and returned home to my parents. By Easter 1966, Bishop Bolter of Fulda, Germany, had accepted me as a priest in his diocese, and so I was now free to rejoin my course and travel to Germany. These few months in Melbourne also gave me time to evaluate what had happened around the shrine in Kew. The younger set had been practically finished, and the girls' groups were practically non-existent. Many of the former consecrated girls had striven to maintain the covenant days, but due to lack of leadership and mounting opposition had given in. However, it was encouraging to see that our mother cared that each was fruitful in her vocation and that the life gained from Schoenstatt was a vital influence in their living. Father continued, "Before leaving for Schoenstatt, I visited our sisters in Ashfield and met Father Archbold in order to discuss the new start in Mount Druitt. It was a providential offering. We needed to be ready to accept this challenge. After Easter 1966, I left for Germany and was able to meet Father Kentenich face to face for the first time. The years of experience in exile had been worth it. I was home, and now, with a new beginning in Mount Druitt, a new chapter of Schoenstatt in Australia was beginning." Father Evans's final words to the conference back in 1991 were, "The question is always in one's heart, what happens to the shrine in Kew? Our Mother and Queen accepted it as her throne of grace. Would she now leave it, and it becomes obsolete? What of the foundations of love, sacrifice, and life which had been placed in it? The bearers of the shrine no longer believed in the secret of Schoenstatt and had broken attachment to the original covenant and our Father. But that has also happened in the original shrine in Schoenstatt. Is the plant dead or dormant? Has its purpose finished and been transferred, or is it waiting to be rediscovered and recaptured and watered?" Father finished off with the challenge to recapture our shrine in Kew. This challenge was taken up by a small group of people in 1994. Now, for almost 30 years, members of Schoenstatt have been responding to the challenge, bringing their contributions to the capital of grace. While Father Evans was still alive, he actively encouraged those active in the movement in Melbourne, and his last will left many valuable items to them with the hope that one day Schoenstatt would again flourish around the shrine in Melbourne. And now we are being challenged to find a new home for our Mother and Queen in Melbourne. Thank you. Some questions for discussion. What has Father Evans's perspective of our Australian Schoenstatt history awakened in each one of us? What response do you feel called to make to the challenge to find a new home for our Mother Thrice Admirable in Melbourne? And thirdly, discuss ways in which we can strengthen our loyalty to the essential elements of Schoenstatt life mentioned by Father Evans. Thank you. Have a good discussion.